There's a moment that happens in nearly every relationship with a narcissist, one so quiet, so easily dismissed in isolation, that almost nobody recognizes it as the beginning of something calculated until years later, looking back with the clarity only hindsight can provide. It's the moment you first think to yourself that seemed like it came out of nowhere. The sudden coldness after an unusually good week, the cutting comment that arrives right after you've shared something vulnerable, the abrupt withdrawal of affection exactly when things were finally starting to feel stable, secure, sustainable. In the moment, each of these incidents feels isolated, confusing, disconnected from any clear cause. You search for what you might have done to trigger it, come up empty, and eventually chalk it up to moodiness, stress, the ordinary unpredictability of loving an imperfect person. But here's the truth that changes everything once you finally see it clearly. It was never random. Every single one of those confusing, seemingly disconnected incidents followed a pattern so consistent, so mechanically predictable that once you learn to recognize it, you'll be able to identify exactly when the next attack is coming, sometimes days before it actually arrives. Today, we're going to map out that pattern completely, tracing the specific triggers that consistently precede a narcissist's cruelty. And by the end of this, you're going to understand something that reframes your entire relationship history. You weren't dealing with random moodiness or unpredictable emotional instability. You were dealing with a system, one calibrated with disturbing precision around a single underlying purpose that had almost nothing to do with anything you actually did. Let's start with the first trigger in this pattern because it's often the most confusing one to recognize, precisely because it seems to reward you for exactly the wrong thing. Trigger 1: your visible happiness, independent of him. This is one of the cruelest, most consistently observed patterns in narcissistic relationships, and it's also one of the most difficult to recognize while you're living inside it, because recognizing it requires accepting something deeply uncomfortable. That your joy itself, when it existed independent of his influence or contribution, became a threat significant enough to warrant deliberate sabotage. Think back through the relationship, and you'll likely find a consistent, almost mechanical pattern hiding in plain sight. That promotion you were genuinely excited about, followed within days by some manufactured crisis or cutting comment that dampened your excitement completely. That reunion with old friends that left you glowing with genuine happiness, followed by an argument that seemed to come from nowhere, timed with suspicious precision right after you returned home. That period of genuine confidence, independent success, or simple contentment that always seemed to coincide with an escalation in criticism, coldness, or manufactured conflict. This isn't coincidence, and understanding why requires understanding something crucial about narcissistic psychology that we've touched on throughout previous conversations. A narcissist's sense of significance depends entirely on being the primary source of your emotional experience, whether that experience is positive or negative. When you experience genuine happiness that has nothing to do with him, that happiness represents a direct threat to his psychological centrality in your life because it demonstrates, undeniably, that your capacity for joy doesn't actually require his involvement, his approval, or his contribution in order to exist. This threat activates something almost mechanical in narcissistic psychology, an instinctive drive to reassert his relevance by disrupting exactly the independent source of joy that revealed his own dispensability. This is why the timing of these disruptions so often feels suspiciously precise, arriving right after your happiest, most independently fulfilling moments, rather than during periods when you're already struggling, or when his intervention might genuinely be needed or appreciated. Trigger 2: growing closeness with people outside the relationship. This second trigger operates on a similar underlying principle, but focuses specifically on your relationships with other people rather than your general emotional state. Watch closely if you're currently in or recently out of a relationship with a narcissist, and you'll likely notice a consistent pattern. Any deepening connection with friends, family members, or even professional colleagues tends to precede some form of disruption, whether through direct criticism of those specific relationships, manufactured conflicts that consume your time and energy, or subtle campaigns designed to create distance between you and the people who might otherwise provide genuine support and perspective. This pattern exists because a narcissist's control over you depends significantly on your isolation, or at least your emotional and practical dependence, primarily on him rather than a genuinely diverse support network. Other meaningful relationships represent competing sources of validation, competing perspectives that might eventually help you recognize patterns you're too close to see clearly on your own, competing claims on your time and attention that reduce his own centrality in your daily life. This is precisely why so many people report a specific, painful pattern throughout narcissistic relationships. Every time a friendship started deepening in meaningful ways, some conflict or crisis seemed to interrupt it. Every time family relationships showed signs of genuine repair or closeness, something happened that created renewed distance or tension. This isn't random misfortune, it's calculated disruption, deployed specifically because your growing closeness with anyone else represented a direct threat to the isolated dependency his control actually requires in order to function effectively. Trigger 3. Your growing competence or self-sufficiency. This third trigger reveals something particularly insidious about how narcissistic attack patterns function because it targets not your relationships or your emotional state directly, but your practical, demonstrated capability in the world. Watch closely, and you'll likely notice that periods where you developed new skills, gained new independence, or demonstrated increasing self-sufficiency in areas that used to require his involvement or approval consistently preceded some form of undermining, whether through direct criticism of your competence, subtle sabotage of your efforts, or manufactured situations designed to make you doubt your own capability. This pattern makes complete sense once you understand what genuine self-sufficiency actually threatens in a narcissistic dynamic. If his position in your life depends on you needing him, whether for practical support, emotional validation, or simply his approval as confirmation of your own worth, then any evidence that you're becoming genuinely capable of managing your own life without his involvement represents a direct threat to that entire foundation. This is why you might have noticed a consistent pattern where learning a new skill, taking on new responsibility at work, or simply demonstrating growing confidence in your own judgment tended to trigger increased criticism, increased doubt planting, or subtle attempts to reassert his authority over decisions you'd previously handled competently on your own. This trigger explains something that often confuses people during and after these relationships: the sense that their partner seemed almost threatened by their success, their growth, their increasing independence, even when that partner claimed to want them to thrive and flourish. This apparent contradiction resolves once you understand that his stated desire for your success and his actual psychological need for your continued dependence exist in genuine tension, and when push comes to shove, the underlying need for dependence almost always wins out over any stated commitment to your genuine flourishing. Trigger 4. Moments when you begin trusting your own perception over his narrative. This fourth trigger operates at perhaps the most fundamental level of all, because it targets not simply your external circumstances or relationships, but your internal relationship with your own perception and judgment. Throughout a relationship with a narcissist, there are typically specific moments where you begin, even briefly, to trust what you're directly observing over whatever narrative he's constructed to explain it away. These moments, recognizing an inconsistency in his story, noticing a pattern he's tried to obscure, simply trusting your own memory of an event over his confident insistence that it happened differently, represent some of the most consistent triggers for escalated cruelty in the entire relationship. This makes sense once you understand how heavily narcissistic control depends on narrative dominance, the ability to shape and control the story of what's actually happening, what actually matters, what actually constitutes reasonable versus unreasonable behavior. Every time you demonstrate genuine trust in your own perception, even in small, seemingly insignificant ways, you're directly challenging this narrative control, revealing that his version of events isn't automatically accepted as the only valid interpretation available. This is precisely why you might notice that moments of growing clarity, moments where you finally started recognizing patterns you'd previously excused or explained away, so often preceded some of the most intense escalation in the entire relationship. This escalation isn't coincidental. It's a direct response to the exact threat your growing clarity represents, an increasingly desperate attempt to reassert narrative control precisely because that control was beginning for the first time to genuinely slip. Trigger 5. Any indication that you might actually leave. This fifth and final trigger is perhaps the most intense of all because it represents the ultimate threat to everything a narcissistic dynamic depends on, your continued presence and availability as a source of supply. Even the smallest indication that you might genuinely be considering leaving, whether through explicit statements, subtle behavioral changes, or simply a shift in your emotional investment that he senses more than consciously articulates, tends to trigger the most intense response in this entire pattern. This might look like sudden dramatic escalation in love bombing, an intensity of affection and attention that seems designed specifically to counter whatever distance you've begun creating. It might look like the opposite, increased cruelty, designed to destabilize you enough that you become too anxious, too uncertain, too preoccupied with managing the immediate crisis to actually follow through on genuinely leaving. Sometimes it looks like both simultaneously, an exhausting, disorienting combination of intensified affection and intensified cruelty that keeps you genuinely uncertain about what's actually happening or what you should actually do. This trigger explains why so many people report their most confusing, most destabilizing experiences within these relationships occurring precisely during periods when they were seriously considering leaving, rather than during periods of ordinary relational stress. This isn't coincidental timing. It's a direct, almost automatic response to the single greatest threat a narcissistic dynamic can face: the genuine possibility of losing access to a source of supply that has become deeply relied upon, regardless of how poorly that reliance has ever been reciprocated. Together, these 5 triggers reveal something that completely reframes how you likely understood your own relationship history. The cruelty you experienced was never actually random, never actually simply moodiness or unpredictable emotional instability. It followed a consistent, almost mechanical pattern, calibrated specifically around protecting his psychological centrality in your life, whether that centrality was threatened by your independent joy, your outside relationships, your growing competence, your increasing clarity, or your potential departure. And here's where understanding this pattern completely transforms into something genuinely useful. Because once you can see these 5 triggers clearly, retrospectively mapped across your own relationship history, something remarkable happens to how you understand everything that occurred. The confusion that used to accompany every seemingly random incident of cruelty dissolves, replaced by a clarity that feels almost clinical in its precision. You can now trace nearly every difficult moment back to one of these 5 specific triggers, revealing a system so consistent it could almost be charted on a graph, rather than the chaotic unpredictability you spent years trying to navigate without any reliable map. This retrospective clarity matters enormously, and not simply as an intellectual exercise in understanding what happened. It matters because it fundamentally changes the story you've likely been telling yourself about your own role in the relationship's difficulties. For years, perhaps, you've wondered what you did to trigger specific incidents of cruelty, searching for some flaw in your own behavior that might explain the pattern. Some way you could have communicated differently, behaved differently, anticipated his needs more effectively in order to prevent the coldness or cruelty that always seemed to follow your happiest, most confident, most independent moments. Understanding this pattern reveals something crucial. You were never actually doing anything wrong. The behaviors that consistently triggered escalation, your happiness, your outside relationships, your growing competence, your increasing clarity, your potential departure, weren't flaws requiring correction. They were exactly the healthy, normal aspects of a genuinely flourishing life that any reasonable partner should have celebrated rather than sabotaged. The problem was never your joy, your friendships, your growth, your perception, or your autonomy. The problem was a system specifically calibrated to punish exactly these healthy expressions of your own independent selfhood, precisely because they threatened a dynamic that required your continued dependence in order to function. This understanding also explains something crucial about why the relationship felt so exhausting to navigate, even during periods that should have theoretically felt stable and secure. Because once you understand that your own genuine flourishing consistently triggered escalated cruelty, you begin to understand the impossible bind this created. You were essentially punished for exactly the things that should have made your life better, which meant genuine growth and genuine relational safety became fundamentally incompatible within this specific dynamic, regardless of how much effort you invested in trying to achieve both simultaneously. Here's what becomes possible once this pattern is fully, completely understood, not just intellectually, but in the deeper, more integrated way that actually changes how you move forward. You develop a kind of predictive clarity that protects you in every future relationship, professional interaction, or friendship where similar patterns might eventually attempt to establish themselves, because now you know exactly what to watch for. Now you understand that if genuine happiness, genuine outside connection, genuine competence, genuine clarity, or genuine autonomy consistently triggers escalated conflict or cruelty from someone in your life, this isn't simply unfortunate incompatibility or occasional friction. It's a pattern worth taking seriously, worth naming clearly, worth using as genuine data about whether this relationship can actually support your continued flourishing, rather than requiring you to shrink your own life in order to maintain whatever fragile piece currently exists. This is perhaps the most valuable gift hidden inside fully understanding this attack pattern. It transforms confusion into genuine pattern recognition, one that applies far beyond this specific relationship into every future context where someone's response to your genuine flourishing reveals something important about whether they're actually capable of celebrating your growth or whether they require your continued smallness in order to feel secure in their own significance. If you recognize this pattern clearly in your own relationship history, understand exactly what this recognition means and doesn't mean. It doesn't mean you were foolish for not seeing it sooner, because these patterns are specifically designed to feel random, disconnected, impossible to trace while you're living inside them, without the benefit of the retrospective clarity that comes only after enough time and enough distance to finally see the full shape of what was actually happening. It doesn't mean you were somehow responsible for triggering cruelty through your own reasonable, healthy behavior, because the behaviors that triggered this pattern were never actually flaws requiring correction. They were exactly the kind of genuine flourishing any healthy relationship should have celebrated rather than punished. What this recognition does mean is something far more valuable than either of those painful alternative interpretations. It means you now carry a kind of pattern literacy that protects you moving forward, an ability to recognize, far earlier than you could before, whether someone's response to your genuine joy, your outside relationships, your growing competence, your increasing clarity, or your emerging autonomy reveals someone capable of genuine partnership, or someone whose own psychological fragility requires your continued diminishment in order to feel secure. This is what it ultimately means to understand that it was never random. Not because understanding this erases the pain of what you experienced, but because it finally completely transforms that pain into something usable, something protective, something that ensures you'll never again mistake calculated cruelty for random moodiness, never again search for some flaw in your own healthy, flourishing behavior that might explain a pattern that was never actually about anything you did wrong in the first place. You weren't the problem. Your happiness, Your connections, your growth, your clarity, and your autonomy were never flaws to be corrected. They were simply, finally, undeniable evidence of exactly the kind of life you deserved to build all along. A life someone else once found threatening enough to attack, precisely because it revealed how little he actually had to offer you once you stopped needing him in order to feel whole.